Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Dramatic music rises as a dark mist rolls across a wooded New England landscape. Old, creaking signs read, Salem Village, 1692. A bell tolls in the distance. Fade into a close-up of a hand, trembling as it writes a name on a parchment scroll, another person accused of witchcraft. A narrator begins. Imagine living in a town where your neighbor's word could mean your death. No proof, no defense. Just a whispered accusation, and suddenly you're a witch. Cinematic flashes appear. A woman screaming in court, gallows, silhouetted at dusk, villagers in panic, and a judge slamming down a gavel. But what if fear was just the surface? What if something darker was at play? Jealousy, land disputes, religious control. Was this truly mass hysteria? Or something far more calculated? We see a shadowy figure watching a trial from the back of a packed meeting house, his face obscured. The music intensifies. Tonight, we dig into one of the darkest chapters in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. What really caused the chaos? And who benefited from the terror? Fade to black. We transition from the eerie cold open into the historical foundation. This is where the facts meet the fear. In February 1692, in the small Puritan settlement of Salem Village, Massachusetts, two young girls, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, began exhibiting strange behaviors. They screamed, convulsed, spoke in tongues. The deeply religious community was terrified. The local minister, Reverend Samuel Paris, Betty's father, quickly suspected witchcraft. Under pressure, the girls pointed fingers. The first to be accused, Tituba, Reverend Paris's enslaved woman of Caribbean origin. From that moment on, panic spread like wildfire. Over the next 15 months, more than 200 people would be accused of practicing witchcraft. These weren't just strangers. Neighbors turned on each other, friends betrayed friends, and even respected members of the church found themselves in chains. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was established in 1692 in colonial Massachusetts specifically to handle the surge of witchcraft accusations that emerged during what would become the Salem Witch Trials. The name Oyer and Terminer comes from the French, meaning to hear and determine, reflecting the court's purpose, to investigate and render judgment on the accused witches. What made this court particularly controversial was its acceptance of spectral evidence, a type of testimony based on visions, dreams, or apparitions. Witnesses, often young girls, claimed that the specters or spirits of the accused were tormenting them even if those accused were physically elsewhere. This kind of evidence had no physical proof and relied solely on the supposed victim's word, making it nearly impossible for the accused to defend themselves. Nonetheless, the court considered such evidence admissible and credible. Key figures presided over these trials, including Chief Justice William Stoughton, who was known for his stern adherence to the belief in the reality of witchcraft, and Judge Samuel Sewall, who would later publicly repent for his role in the trials. The court operated under the authority and approval of the colonial government, and the broader social climate played a critical role in its formation and actions. Influential ministers like Cotton Mather supported the court's mission, urging rigorous prosecution of those suspected of witchcraft to protect the community from perceived diabolical threats. Mather's stance reflected the deeply Puritan worldview of the time, which saw Satan's influence as a real and constant danger. The Court of Oyer and Terminer ultimately convicted and sentenced many to death before it was dissolved later that year, in part due to growing public doubt about the legitimacy of spectral evidence and the morality of the trials. Its creation and the events that followed stand as a stark example of how fear, religion, and flawed legal processes can combine to produce a tragic miscarriage of justice. By May 1693, when the Salem Witch Trials finally came to a close, the damage was undeniable. 19 people had been executed by hanging, most of them women, and one man, Giles Corey, was subjected to a brutal and rare form of execution known as pressing. Corey refused to enter a plea, a legal tactic intended to prevent the court from confiscating his estate. In response, authorities placed heavy stones on his chest until he was crushed to death, his silence a grim protest against the court's legitimacy. Despite the deaths and the trauma that gripped the community, no tangible evidence of witchcraft ever emerged. No hexes were verified, no pacts with the devil uncovered, only the testimonies of frightened or manipulative accusers and a judicial system willing to accept invisible evidence. The trials have often been characterized as a case of mass hysteria, but this simplifies the deeper and more troubling causes behind the tragedy. At the core of the crisis was a volatile mixture of religious extremism, social instability, and political uncertainty. Salem Village was steeped in Puritan ideology, a worldview that saw life as a spiritual battleground between God and the devil. In such a rigid framework, dissent or deviation was often interpreted as evidence of evil influence. The community's spiritual fears were inflamed by sermons warning of Satan's efforts to infiltrate godly society, especially through the most vulnerable, women, the poor, or the socially isolated. But fear alone doesn't explain the scale of the catastrophe. Power struggles within Salem Village played a major role. The village was divided between rival factions, some aligned with the Salem town elite, others seeking independence. Ministerial disputes, land disagreements, and long-standing grudges simmered beneath the surface. Accusations of witchcraft often aligned with these social rifts, suggesting that personal vendettas and community tensions found an outlet through the trials. At the same time, colonial Massachusetts was undergoing broader political changes. The revocation of the original Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter in 1684, followed by the imposition of the new charter in 1691, created confusion and a vacuum of authority. The resulting instability made it easier for extraordinary legal and religious measures, like the Court of Oyer and Terminer, to take root and act with little resistance. Salem, with its uniquely charged atmosphere and unresolved conflicts, became a perfect tinderbox. The accusations started among a small group of girls but spread rapidly, engulfing the village and beyond. What began as strange fits and mysterious ailments quickly spiraled into a sweeping purge of perceived evil, sanctioned by the highest authorities in the colony. The Salem Witch Trials are remembered not just for their horror, but for the way they exposed the dangers of unchecked power, the vulnerability of the marginalized, and the destructive potential of fear when weaponized through belief in authority. Understanding why Salem fell into this nightmare is key to recognizing how societal pressures can warp justice, and how quickly the line between order and chaos can vanish. To truly understand what unfolded in Salem, we need to look beyond just the trials and accusations. We need to examine the psychology of mass hysteria, or what scholars today call mass psychogenic illness. What happened in Salem wasn't just about law or religion. It was about the human psyche under extreme pressure. The phenomenon we now understand as mass psychogenic illness or mass hysteria arises when a group of people, often in stressful, isolated, or deeply hierarchical communities, begin to display similar physical or psychological symptoms. These symptoms have no identifiable organic cause and are instead sparked by collective fear, cultural cues, and the potent force of suggestion. In Salem, the environment was a perfect storm: a rigid, theocratic society, intense social and spiritual anxiety, and a deep belief in the supernatural. The Puritans who settled in Massachusetts didn't see themselves as ordinary colonists. They believed they were chosen by God to establish a model Christian society, a city upon a hill. This vision came with immense pressure to conform, to root out sin, and to live in strict moral purity. Anything that threatened that purity, especially unexplained phenomena like illness, erratic behavior, or misfortune, was viewed through a spiritual lens. There were no psychological explanations for trauma or emotional disturbance. Instead, the Puritans turned to what they knew: scripture, sermons, and the ever-present threat of the devil. Satan, to them, wasn't symbolic. He was an active, dangerous force. He could inhabit the body of a person, particularly those seen as spiritually weak or socially suspect: women, children, the poor, or the nonconforming. The devil could act through them, seduce them, or use them to undermine the community's godliness. This belief created intense paranoia. If someone displayed odd behavior, it wasn't considered a medical issue or personal crisis. It was a sign of demonic activity. This intense fear created a psychological environment where suggestion could spread rapidly. A young girl convulsing or screaming might have been experiencing stress, abuse, or even ergot poisoning. But once her symptoms were labeled as evidence of witchcraft, others began exhibiting similar behaviors. In a culture primed to believe in supernatural threats, one person's distress became a community-wide emergency. The fear of being accused or of having someone close to you accused heightened the tension. Denying belief in witchcraft could be seen as suspicious. Confessing, even falsely, might save your life. It was a no-win situation, and fear fed itself. The conformity demanded by Puritanism also played a major role. Individualism was not celebrated. It was viewed as dangerous. Standing out, even unintentionally, marked someone as different, and different was dangerous. In such a tightly controlled society, any breach of social norms could be interpreted as a sign of devilry. This created a constant undercurrent of fear, not just of hellfire, but of social exclusion, punishment, and the unpredictable whims of authority. In essence, Salem became a pressure cooker of religious extremism, psychological stress, and collective delusion. The panic wasn't spontaneous. It was cultivated, fed by sermons, reinforced by the courts, and legitimized by respected leaders. Once the idea of invisible forces and demonic possession took hold, it became almost impossible to disprove. The result was a communal descent into fear and accusation, where reason was overwhelmed by belief, and the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Now add religion into the mix. These were people who believed deeply in predestination, that one's soul was either saved or damned from birth. Anxiety over salvation was intense. The Puritan worldview didn't allow much room for uncertainty or mental illness. So when young girls began to convulse, scream, and claim visions, the community didn't turn to medicine or psychology, they turned to theology. So what was going on with the girls? Historians and psychologists have debated their motives for centuries. Some argue they experienced conversion disorder, where psychological stress manifests physically, common in repressive, high-stakes environments. Others suggest they were simply acting, consciously or not, as a way to gain attention or power in a society that offered them little agency. After all, these were mostly young girls, children, suddenly being listened to by powerful men, having their voices matter. Another possibility? They genuinely believed it. In a world saturated with religious fervor and warnings about Satan, it's not hard to imagine they internalized their fears to the point of experiencing real symptoms. But whether it was trauma, suggestion, or manipulation, once the accusations began, they took on a life of their own. The fear was contagious. People believed if they didn't speak up, they'd be next. And in that kind of fear-driven environment, rationality collapses, and hysteria reigns. To truly understand the Salem Witch Trials, we need to go beyond the image of panicked villagers pointing fingers in a frenzy of superstition. Beneath the surface of the accusations and hysteria was a powder keg of political tension, economic rivalry, and long-standing personal grudges that had been building for years. At the heart of this conflict were two powerful families in Salem Village, the Putnams and the Porters. The Putnam family were devout, conservative Puritans who clung tightly to the traditional values of their community. They were influential in village affairs and had long viewed Salem town, the more urban and economically vibrant neighbor, with suspicion and even hostility. For the Putnams, Salem Village was a place that needed to remain pure, spiritually disciplined, and free from the corrupting influences of the outside world. In this vision, Reverend Samuel Parris, strict, uncompromising, and aligned with their worldview, was the ideal spiritual leader. The Putnams strongly backed him, and through him, they exerted significant control over local politics and the pulpit. On the other side were the Porters, who represented a different vision for Salem's future. Wealthier and more connected to the commercial lifeblood of Salem town, the Porters favored modernization and economic growth. They were more flexible in their religious views and more interested in practical matters of trade and influence than in rigid Puritan orthodoxy. This put them at odds with the Putnams, not just ideologically, but financially and politically as well. The Porters often clashed with the Putnams over land disputes, inheritance conflicts, and the distribution of power within the community. These tensions weren't just abstract. They showed up in tangible ways: voting patterns in town, meetings, disputes over property boundaries, and efforts to control the local church. When the witchcraft accusations began, many of the people targeted were either aligned with the Porters or had, in some way, challenged the authority of the Putnam faction. In fact, Thomas Putnam, the patriarch of the family, played a key role in fueling the hysteria. His daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., was one of the most active accusers, and many historians believe that she and others were manipulated, whether consciously or not, into advancing the family's interests. In this light, the Salem Witch Trials weren't just about fear of the devil. They were also about protecting economic status, winning political battles, and settling old scores. The trials became a weapon in a much older and deeper struggle over who would control the future of the village. And in the end, that struggle led to the deaths of 20 people and the imprisonment of many more, all in the name of a righteousness that masked something much darker, the pursuit of power. Understanding. The Salem Witch Trials through this lens doesn't take away from the tragedy, it deepens it. Because what happened in 1692 wasn't just a moment of collective delusion. It was a calculated power play that used fear as a tool and turned neighbor against neighbor. That's the real story of Salem, one where belief and ambition collided with deadly consequences. And then the accusations started. Notably, many of those targeted were people connected to the Porter camp or those who had challenged Putnam influence. Coincidence? Probably not. Thomas Putnam, in particular, emerges as a key manipulator. His daughter, Anne Putnam Jr., was one of the most active accusers, claiming to see visions and naming dozens of people as witches. But here's the twist. Many of those accused were landowners. And guess who sometimes benefited when their property was forfeited? That's right, the Putnams and their allies. In a time when land equaled power, a well-placed accusation could eliminate a rival or open the door to economic gain. This wasn't just fear. It was strategy. The legal system only made things worse. The courts allowed spectral evidence, testimony that someone's spirit or specter harmed another in a vision or dream. This kind of proof was impossible to disprove and totally unscientific. Imagine being accused based on someone's nightmare, and you had no way to defend yourself. Due process, as we understand it today, was virtually absent during the Salem Witch Trials. The moment someone was accused of witchcraft, the burden wasn't on the accusers to prove guilt. It was on the accused to somehow prove their innocence in a system that was already stacked against them. Spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spirit had appeared to the accuser in a dream or vision, was not only admissible, but often decisive. Hearsay and emotion ruled the courtroom. Logic, evidence, and fairness were swept aside by fear. Confession became the twisted loophole for survival. Ironically, those who admitted to impossible crimes, flying on broomsticks, signing the devil's book, or attending witches' sabbaths, were often spared the noose. The more sensational and vivid the confession, the more cooperative and redeemable the court believed the accused to be. Those who refused to confess, especially if they maintained their innocence with integrity and calm, were far more likely to be executed. In a perverse twist of justice, telling the truth became the quickest route to the gallows. This wasn't just mass hysteria spiraling out of control. The Salem Witch Trials were a targeted, weaponized moment in history. Accusations didn't fall randomly. They often aligned with simmering family disputes, land rivalries, and social tensions. The powerful could remove inconvenient neighbors, silence critics, and settle generational feuds under the holy guise of purging evil. Religious justice became a smokescreen for political and personal gain. It's tempting to write the whole event off as senseless panic, but that would be a mistake. It was chaos, yes, but it was chaos with an agenda. Behind the screaming girls and the dramatic court scenes were people making calculated decisions. Some truly believed they were doing God's work. Others saw an opportunity to seize land, eliminate rivals, or boost their social standing. To fully understand why the Salem Witch Trials exploded when they did, we have to zoom out. Salem wasn't some isolated village gripped by random hysteria. It was the epicenter of a much larger storm. A storm made up of war, political chaos, economic strain, and spiritual anxiety. First, let's talk about King William's War. This wasn't just some distant European conflict. It had real, devastating consequences for the people living in the American colonies. The war was part of a larger power struggle between England and France, with both sides enlisting Native American allies and colonial militias to fight on the front lines. For the people of New England, particularly in the northern frontier regions like Maine, the war meant violence, terror, and constant insecurity. In the end, the Salem Witch Trials revealed how fear can be molded into a tool, and how fragile justice becomes when it's influenced by unchecked power, deep grudges, and the human hunger for control. Many of the families who lived in those frontier areas had to flee when their towns were attacked. Homes were burned, family members were killed or captured, and entire communities were displaced. These were not isolated incidents. They were brutal personal losses that left deep psychological scars. And where did many of these refugees go? A large number resettled in places like Salem Village. So now picture this. Salem Village in the early 1690s wasn't just dealing with its own internal feuds. It was also absorbing a wave of traumatized newcomers. These weren't just people looking for a fresh start. They were people who had seen their homes destroyed, had buried loved ones, and were carrying with them a deep-seated fear of being attacked again. Many of them had lost everything, and now they were living in a new place that was already boiling over with economic rivalries, religious tensions, and political disputes. That fear, raw, fresh, and unresolved, was a spark. It created a heightened sense of paranoia and an us versus them mentality. Outsiders were no longer just strangers. They were potential threats. Even neighbors could become suspects. In that kind of environment, the idea that invisible enemies could be hiding in plain sight didn't seem so far-fetched. Witchcraft, in that context, became a way to explain the unexplainable, a scapegoat for everything that was going wrong. So while King William's War may not seem directly connected to the Salem Witch Trials at first glance, its impact was enormous. It's brought waves of fear, mistrust, and grief into an already divided community. And when that fear mixed with religious extremism and local power struggles, it created the perfect conditions for hysteria to take root. Now add economic pressure. Crops were failing, trade was disrupted, taxes were rising. Salem Village was deeply divided between farmers who were struggling and a growing merchant class in nearby Salem town that was thriving. These economic divisions intensified class resentment. To those who felt left behind, the idea of spiritual corruption, witches working to destroy the community from within, started to make a dangerous kind of sense. Politically, things were also falling apart. In 1684, the original Massachusetts Bay Colony Charter was revoked by England, stripping the colony of its legal foundation. For years, the colony operated in legal limbo, and then in 1692, a mere weeks before the witch trials began, a new governor, Sir William Phips, arrived. With a brand new charter, the entire legal system was being rebuilt on the fly, and in the chaos, people panicked. No clear structure, no checks and balances, just a brand new court that rushed to prove its authority, and through it all, Puritanism. A faith built on the idea of spiritual warfare, sin, and the ever-present threat of Satan's influence. In times of fear and uncertainty, this belief system turned neighbors into suspects. Anyone could be the devil's tool, especially those who were different, outspoken, or simply disliked. So by 1692, Salem was primed for combustion. It wasn't just one thing, it was everything. The village had become a pressure cooker. Terrified, refugees from brutal frontier wars brought trauma and paranoia. Economic insecurity plagued the area, with families fighting over land and inheritance in a world where survival was never guaranteed. Religious fervor ran high, driven by Puritan leaders who preached that the devil was always lurking, ready to corrupt the faithful. Add to that a broken colonial government, paralyzed by political instability and unable to provide order or justice. And at the heart of the village, two rival factions, the Putnams and the Porters, were locked in a bitter power struggle, using the pulpit and the courts as their battlegrounds. It's no wonder that when strange behavior appeared in a group of young girls, fits, trances, screaming, they didn't see a medical problem. They saw witchcraft. And once that idea took hold, it spread like wildfire. In a society already on edge, accusations became a way to purge enemies, settle old scores, and restore a sense of order, no matter how twisted that order was. The Salem Witch trials weren't a random outbreak of madness. They were the violent, tragic eruption of all the fractures in that society. Every fear, every rivalry, every unresolved trauma came to the surface and found an outlet in the form of a witch hunt. Salem was the perfect storm. A community under stress, pushed to the brink, with no release valve. And when that storm finally broke, it didn't just take lives. It left a scar on American history. A warning about what happens when fear overrides reason, when justice is driven by power, and when a community turns on itself. The echoes of Salem still resonate today, not just as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror showing how fragile truth and justice can be when fear takes over. Let's break down 3 of the most revealing and disturbing cases from the Salem Witch Trials, each one showing how fear, power, and prejudice shaped the madness in a different way. First, Tituba. Tituba was an enslaved woman of Arawak or African descent owned by Reverend Samuel Parris. When the young girls in his household began exhibiting strange fits, they accused Tituba of witchcraft, making her the first person arrested in the Salem Panic. She was an easy target. She was non-white, a foreigner, and low in social status. But what's most fascinating is her confession. Tituba didn't deny the charges. Instead, she described vivid stories of devil worship, animal familiars, and black magic. Why? Most historians believe she understood that confessing might save her life, or she was pressured, threatened, or even beaten into telling the court what it wanted to hear. In a twisted way, her confession poured gasoline on the fire, validating the fears of the community and giving the court license to arrest more witches. Tituba survived the trials, but only because her usefulness as a scapegoat helped kickstart the hysteria. Next, Rebecca Nurse. She was the opposite of Tituba in nearly every way, a white, elderly, respected Puritan woman from a devout family. Her arrest shocked the community. If someone as pious and upstanding as Rebecca could be accused, no one was safe. During her trial, the evidence against her was incredibly flimsy, mostly based on the spectral claims of afflicted girls, who said her spirit was tormenting them. The jury initially acquitted her, but under pressure from the court and the accusers, the decision was reversed. She was found guilty and hanged. Rebecca Nurse's case shows how fear overtook reason, how even a lifetime of moral living meant nothing once the wheels of paranoia were turning. Her wrongful conviction rattled the entire colony, pushing many to start questioning the legitimacy of the trials. Giles Corey's story is one of the most harrowing and powerful chapters of the Salem Witch Trials. He wasn't a typical victim. Corey was a tough, wealthy farmer in his 80s, known for being stubborn and unafraid to speak his mind. But when he was accused of witchcraft, his response was anything but ordinary. He didn't beg for mercy, he didn't confess. In fact, he didn't even enter a plea. And that's where things took a dramatic turn. According to the legal system, at the time, a person had to plead guilty or not guilty before a trial could proceed. But Corey refused. He knew that if he entered a plea and was found guilty, the government could legally confiscate his estate, leaving his children and grandchildren with nothing. By staying silent, he exploited a loophole. No plea meant no trial, and no trial meant no legal grounds to seize his land. It was a calculated act of resistance, but the price was unimaginable. In response, the court used a punishment known as peine forte et dure, literally, strong and hard punishment. They laid Giles Corey in a pit, placed a wooden board over his chest, and began piling heavy stones on top of him, slowly, deliberately. Over the course of 2 agonizing days, they tried to force him to speak. But he never did. His reported final words have become legendary. More weight. Not a confession, not a plea, just defiance. Corey's death wasn't just an execution. It was a message. A brutal show of force meant to break the will of anyone who dared to resist the court. But in the end, it had the opposite effect. His silence spoke volumes. It exposed the trials for what they had truly become. Not a pursuit of justice or spiritual purity, but a tool for control, punishment, and greed. By choosing death over submission, Giles Corey became a symbol of resistance, not just to the injustice of the Salem Witch Trials, but to any system that values power over people. His story still resonates today as a stark reminder of how far institutions will go to protect themselves and how powerful one act of defiance can be. These three stories, Tituba, Rebecca Nurse, and Giles Corey, offer a chilling cross-section of the Salem Witch Trials. From scapegoating the powerless to turning on the righteous to crushing dissent, each trial shows how quickly justice can be distorted when fear rules and power goes unchecked. As the hysteria subsided, the people of Salem and the Massachusetts colony at large were left to confront the devastating consequences of their actions. By 1693, the tide had turned. Governor William Phips, alarmed by the chaos and increasing doubt about the legitimacy of the trials, disbanded the special court and forbade further arrests for witchcraft. Many of the remaining prisoners were released, but the damage was done. 20 innocent people were dead. Dozens more had had their lives shattered by imprisonment, loss of property, and social ruin. Salem was left haunted, not just by the fear of witches, but by the realization that the true evil had come from within the community itself. And so began a slow, painful reckoning. In the years that followed, some of those who had played leading roles in the trials began to confront what they had done. Judges, jurors, ministers, people once convinced they were doing God's work, began to see the trials for what they truly were, a tragic miscarriage of justice. One of the most notable acts of repentance came from Judge Samuel Sewall. He had been one of the most respected and powerful figures on the court that condemned many to death. But by 1697, his conscience could no longer bear the weight. Standing before his Boston congregation, he publicly confessed his guilt and asked for God's forgiveness. It was a rare and powerful moment of humility from a man who had held life and death in his hands. That same year, the Massachusetts General Court declared a day of fasting and soul-searching. It wasn't just about religious observance, it was an early form of collective mourning, a public admission that something had gone terribly wrong. It was a call to reflect not just on the sins of the accused, but on the sins of the accusers, the judges, and the society that allowed fear to override reason. But even with those gestures, full justice never came. Some families received compensation, but many never saw true restitution. And for the victims, those hanged, those crushed, those left broken, there could be no undoing what had been done. The legacy of Salem lingers because it wasn't just about witches. It was about how easily a society can turn on itself, how quickly fear can be manipulated, and how justice can be twisted when guided by panic instead of principle. The trials may have ended, but their lesson remains, that in times of crisis, the most dangerous enemy is often the one within. Over the next several decades, the government began the slow process of trying to right the wrongs of the Salem Witch Trials. But like much in this story, that process was uneven, incomplete, and far too late for those who had suffered the most. It wasn't as if a switch had flipped and the community suddenly saw the trials as a mistake. Change came gradually, often, only after pressure from the families of the accused. Some convictions were reversed as early as the 1690s, but it would take years, decades even, for the state to formally clear the names of many victims. In 1711, the Massachusetts legislature passed a bill that offered monetary compensation to some of the families of those who had been executed. The total amount was modest, hardly enough to replace lost lives, reputations, or property, and many affected families were excluded from the settlement entirely. Still, it was one of the first formal acknowledgments that a great injustice had taken place. But even with that gesture, full exoneration was elusive. Some names were left off the official lists, either due to bureaucratic oversight or because their families weren't in a position to advocate for them. Incredibly, it wasn't until the 1950s that renewed efforts began to clear additional names, and not until the 2000s, more than 300 years later, that the last known victims of the Salem Witch Trials were officially exonerated. It's a reminder that while fear can spread quickly, healing often takes generations. And even then, it's never complete. The legacy of Salem lives on not just in textbooks and folklore, but in the quiet understanding that justice delayed is still justice denied. For the families who carried the weight of those accusations for centuries, official recognition came far too late, but it was still necessary. It was a final, solemn attempt to say, this was wrong, and we remember. The psychological and cultural scars ran deep. Salem's name became synonymous with injustice and mass hysteria, a stain that lingered for generations. But rather than bury the past, Salem today embraces its history as both a cautionary tale and a source of reflection. The city features memorials, museums, and annual events, not to glorify the tragedy, but to remember the victims and educate future generations about the dangers of fear-driven justice. The legacy of the trials isn't just in books or monuments. It lives in the broader American consciousness as a reminder of how quickly truth can be silenced when fear, religion, and power collide. The echoes of Salem didn't just fade, they evolved. In the 1950s, the United States found itself gripped by a new kind of hysteria. The Red Scare, fueled by Senator Joseph McCarthy's relentless anti-communist campaign, became a modern-day witch hunt. Just like in 1692, the fear wasn't just about actual threats. It was about suspicion, conformity, and control. Accusations flew without proof. People were interrogated, blacklisted, and publicly shamed based on rumors, associations, or past beliefs. Careers in Hollywood, government, and academia were destroyed. Families were torn apart. And much like in Salem, silence or refusal to confess often meant guilt. If you didn't name others, you became suspect yourself. The charge was no longer witchcraft. It was communism. But the mechanics of the hysteria were strikingly similar. Mass paranoia, moral panic, and the weaponization of fear. Arthur Miller even captured this parallel in his iconic play, The Crucible, using the Salem Witch Trials as an allegory for McCarthyism, showing how history was repeating itself with chilling accuracy. And it hasn't stopped there. In the digital age, we're witnessing a new frontier in public judgment. Social media has given rise to a global, instantaneous court of public opinion. A single tweet, a viral video, a misunderstood post, any of these can trigger a wave of outrage. Some call it cancel culture, others call it accountability. But at its heart, the debate reflects the same questions that haunted Salem. Who decides guilt? What is the evidence? And what happens when the mob takes over the mechanisms of justice? In Salem, it was spectral evidence and the fear of invisible forces. Today, it might be a screenshot taken out of context or a soundbite stripped of nuance. The tools have changed. Twitter instead of testimonies, hashtags instead of court records, but the consequences can still be deeply personal and sometimes devastating. The legacy of Salem isn't just historical, it's psychological and cultural. It reminds us how fear can override logic, how the need for control can disguise itself as moral certainty, and how quickly a society can turn on its own. Whether it's 1692, 1954, or the digital now, the lesson is the same. When we abandon due process and rush to judgment, we risk becoming the very thing we fear. And that brings us to the final chilling question. Are we really so different from 1692? Yes, our systems have evolved. We have constitutions, legal protections, and due process, at least in theory. But the core forces that fueled the Salem witch trials, they're still with us. Fear, power, prejudice, the desire to belong, the urge to control. When those emotions mix in the right or wrong conditions, the result can still be devastating. Because fear, when weaponized, doesn't need a courtroom. It just needs a spark. Fear of the outsider, fear of dissent, fear of losing control. And when that fear spreads, unchecked, unchallenged, it can override everything: reason, justice, even basic compassion. So we're left to ask, was Salem purely an outbreak of mass hysteria? A tragic moment of collective delusion? Or was it something more calculated? A convenient mechanism to punish the powerless, to remove rivals, to enforce conformity under the guise of righteousness? Maybe it was both. Maybe the most terrifying thing about Salem is that it blurred those lines so completely, where belief and manipulation fed off each other until no one could tell panic from policy. And maybe that's the real legacy of Salem, not just a cautionary tale from colonial America, but a mirror, a reminder that justice, truth, and morality are fragile. That when we let fear take the reins, when we stop questioning the powerful, and when we silence those on the margins, history doesn't just repeat, it escalates. The witch trials may feel like ancient history, but their lesson? That's timeless. Because Salem wasn't just about witches, it was about us. Thanks for watching. But now it's your turn. What do you think really happened in Salem? Was it mass hysteria fueled by fear and superstition? Or was it something darker, a calculated manipulation of power and control? Drop your theories in the comments. We'll be reading and responding to as many as we can. If you're into peeling back the layers of history, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and tap the bell so you never miss a deep dive like this. And if you thought Salem was chilling, wait until you see our next video, the Spanish Inquisition, faith or fear? It's a story of torture, control, and religious terror you won't want to miss.